Hello and good evening. I'm Tracy Hamston from Moor Meadows and welcome to the first in our series of online talks that we've got for you over the autumn and winter. We're absolutely delighted that naturalist, author and wildlife documentary filmmaker Nick Gates has agreed to talk to us tonight. And we've also got Robin Toogood to tell us all about Orchard Link. Just a few sort of housekeeping bits. There's plenty of time for questions at the end, so if I can ask you to post your questions in the YouTube chat window as we go through, and we'll get to as many of those as we can at the end. Do feel free to say hello to other people if you want to stick something in the chat window and say where you're from. I'm just going to say a few words about Moor Meadows for those of you that are less familiar with us and haven't been to one of our talks before. So Moor Meadows is a Dartmoor-based community group of around 800 landowners, farmers and gardeners who are restoring and creating flower-rich grasslands on every scale, from large farm scale to shed roofs and everything in between. And as anyone knows who has an established hay meadow, they can contain a huge abundance of wildlife, and they're really some of our best habitats. We've also have an online communication platform for people all over Devon and beyond, the Meadow Makers Forum, and there'll be some links to that and the Moor Meadows website in the chat box, I think at the beginning, and we'll pop them up again at the end. And the forum is really where people can talk to each other, swap notes, ask questions, share pictures and all sorts of things. So if you're not a member and like to join up, it's free. So do that. So our first speaker tonight is going to give us a little run through of what Orchard Link is all about. So I want to introduce Robin. So I'll pop them up there. There we go. Good evening, Robin. So Robin Toogood has been involved with Orchard Link for 10 years and is currently the chairman. Although you're now retired, Robin, you've worked in a variety of countryside management jobs, including manager of the South Devon area of outstanding natural beauty. And he lives in South Brent, where he owns a small orchard. But this evening is actually joining us from Glasgow, where I'm sure you probably realise he's there to take part in environmental actions during the COP conference. So I'm going to hand over to you now, Robin, and go for it.
Tracy, thank you. It's to be able to collaborate with Moor Meadows this evening. Orchard Link and Moor Meadows have got a lot of things in common in our shared interests, and I'm imagining that maybe some of you watching this evening might be members of both in both organisations. I really enjoyed reading Nick's book. It really resonated for me. I'm going to say a little bit about Orchard Link, the scene, and so explain. So Orchard Link is a South Devon-based organisation. It's really for enthusiasts, people who are interested in orchards, fruit growing, cider making, and but why South Devon? Why Orchard Link? I'm going to just show a few pictures to set the scene. So I need to hit that, and so yeah, Orchard Link. Why South Devon? I mean, Devon was one of the key cider counties of Britain. In fact, Devon had the greatest number of area of orchards of any county in Britain, 23,000 acres in the late 1800s. But the 1960s, 70s, 80s saw a catastrophic decline in the area of orchards. Loads of orchards were removed, and a lot of the markets for orchard produce had disappeared, so that loads of apples that were left were just rotting on the ground. And there was not only a loss of all the wildlife, but a loss of the distinctive local varieties, as well as the demand for modern apples became much more uniform, much more industrial. So in 1989, an organisation, a London-based organisation called Common Ground, launched a project called Save Our Orchards. It was a national project, and it got taken up locally in South Devon with the South Devon Save Our Orchards campaign. And Orchard Link formed out of that actually it was in 1998. So Orchard Link, we're part of a national network of orchard organisations. What do we do? This is our website. So we've got a range of different things we do and that we offer our members. Membership is open to anybody. And so one of the things we do is we run lots of training courses on how to manage orchards, things like pruning, grafting, vegetation management, cider making, all those kinds of things. And we're just about to launch our winter program of pruning courses. We also run events like this, like talks by Zoom and meetings as well. We've got a equipment which we hire out to our members for apple pressing. This is our biggest apple press. We've got lots of other equipment as well, which our members hire for pressing and pasteurizing. We've got a thing called Harvest Line, which is like a swap shop for members who've got apples to spare or who want to get hold of apples. So that's a free online swap service on our website. We support a load of community orchards as well. There's about 20 or 30 community orchards in our area, running apple days, wassails, social events, all kinds of things like that. So we're very strong on that, and recently had a big lottery funded community orchards project. If you're in learning more, our website there is at the bottom of the slide, www.orchardlink.org.uk. Take a look at our website, join us if you'd like to, and we look forward to more collaboration meadows and more meadow projects. So I think that's all I want to say. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And so I'm looking forward very much to hearing Nick's talk. And Tracy, I'll hand back to you now. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Robin. I know where to come for my press next time. we had a go at making cider for the first time this year, so that's quite an exciting venture. We'll see how it goes. Thanks very much, Robin. I shall take you off there, and I'd like to welcome our main speaker for this evening, Nick. Hello, Nick. So in case you haven't read Nick's books, actually Nick Gates and Ben Macdonald authored the book and spent years visiting a magical traditional orchard and covering lots of its stories each season and looking at the amazing wildlife. And the book Orchard, A Year in England's Eden was really the result of their passion. Nick's talk is a celebration of the extraordinary range of wildlife and ancient orchard supports, making it one of the richest ecosystems left in Britain. And Nick's also going to share how he brought many of those principles that make that orchard such a fantastic wildlife haven back into his small wildlife garden in Bristol, with some successes, including the purple hair streak and great crested newt. So without ado, I shall hand over to you, Nick. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invite to talk to everyone this evening. And yeah, I'm really looking forward to sharing it. So this is our book. It's now come out in softback. It launched last year. It's been really well reviewed. I hope you enjoy it. Anyone who's read it and is yet to read it. I've got a bit of a presentation that I'm going to talk through. Please put any comments or questions into the chat box, and I'll get through as many of those as possible at the end. And yeah, if you've got your own thoughts to share, then, you know, or you want to get in touch with me afterwards, I will share some contact details to get in touch with myself and Ben if you are interested. So Tracy, I'm going to swap now to my presentation, and if you can let me know when that's up, then I will start talking through it. I think, hoping you can see that presentation there. So the first thing is, just double check. Yeah, how did it all begin? The whole book was a complete accident. I met Ben when we were on Springwatch. I'm sure many of you are familiar with Springwatch. There is a role on Springwatch called a story developer, and the role of a story developer is to sit in the truck, the truck that has all of the live cameras beamed to it from around the Springwatch village. So we had nests and halts and sets and dens, and we had to sit for 12 hours a day every day and watch those live cameras and pick out the behavior of the creatures that were on them. And it was a really good way to get to know someone. And by chance, you know, Ben and I were paired together and we struck up a good friendship. And Ben told me about this place that he'd found up in Herefordshire, an old orchard run by some fantastic wildlife farmers. I would like to stress the orchard doesn't belong to either Ben or I. The orchard belongs to Nancy and David. They manage it, in our view, extremely well. It's obviously a managed landscape, but it had some very special creatures that chose to use it. And so the project started. We were just visiting to put up nest boxes and find out what species were using it. Initially, we focused on a few of our sort of target species that we were really keen to get into a nest box: redstarts, woodpeckers, starlings, and various tit species. And each season we went back, we learned more and more about what made a traditional orchard work so well for the wildlife that was using it. And every season we learned something new. And we tried to visit anywhere up to 10, 12 times a season. You know, during the peak nesting season, we'd often visit, you know, multiple days every week. And then, you know, as it calmed off during the winter, we'd visit, you know, every once or twice a month. But we were hooked. This place was better than most of the nature reserves that we chose to visit as naturalists. And we began to document what we were finding. We were putting up, you know, this plethora of different nest boxes and just documenting what was using them. So we were putting up great spotted woodpecker nest boxes and they were never used. And we were putting up green woodpecker boxes and they were never used. And we were putting up less spotted woodpecker nest boxes and they were never used. And we put up a little owl nest box and that was never used. And just by refining over the seasons, you know, our approach to what we expected to get into a nest box and how we monitored the species that were using the boxes, all of the tit species: great tit, blue tit, coal tit, marsh tit, the cavity nesting species, robins, spotted flycatchers, redstarts, which we were able to get into nest boxes. And we realized that our target species, the woodpeckers, simply weren't going to play ball. However hard we tried, they would always choose a natural cavity that they'd excavated themselves, which taught us our first important lesson. It taught us the importance of deadwood, which I'm going to get to later on. This is a sort of typical scene that you'd find us on over the winter. We would stuff Ben's old VW Polo with nest boxes that we would have cleaned out, rechecked, set up ready for a new season. And we'd go back up to the orchards and we'd space them around the place, and we would just, you know, try and cover the orchards. Actually split into 3 different orchards, but we would try and select the trees and we'd learn, you know, where the different spots were that different birds favored. And here are some of the successes from the first few years. You know, we were doing really well. You know, dozens of tits of different species. You know, high figures of redstarts. You know, in one season we had 6 redstart nests. Marsh tits, you know, a really declining tit species, we're using our boxes, and we found that putting up nest boxes in pairs, which is a well-used tactic, meant that the more dominant great tit or blue tit would use one of the nest boxes, and the subordinate marsh tit would share the same territory and use one of the other nest boxes. And that way we were able to keep an eye on nest productivity, and we were submitting that data to the BTO, which is an incredibly valuable resource for them to look at national trends and declines in particular of some of these birds. And then alongside that, we got involved with finding the wild nests. There are some species which you won't get in a nest box, song thrush, blackbird, that much prefer to, or wren, much prefer to use a natural site and build their own nest whenever possible. And that gave us, a real insight into just how biodiverse this orchard was, and the bioabundance. Seeing that every single hedgerow that we tapped had, one blackbird nest in and one song thrush nest. We'd go to the next hedge, a blackbird nest, a song thrush nest. Go to the next hedge, blackbird, song thrush, blackcap. Go to the next hedge, goldfinch, bullfinch. We were seeing this bioabundance, which seemed to be significantly higher than other areas of farmland that we'd come across. And so it was clear that there was something being done really well here, that these birds were thriving in a traditionally managed landscape. It was very low intensity, the orchards, and the species that were using them were there in high number. So it wasn't just one or two pairs, it was dozens of pairs of robins, across the sites, triple figures of thrushes. So it was really, really extraordinary to see this bioabundance, and go in there and on a spring morning, the dawn chorus was absolutely deafening as the feathered alarm clocks shouted at each other. So we wanted to understand how the system worked. What was it about a traditional orchard that really made it so productive? We, as naturalists, we were looking at this landscape and learning all the time, and seeing that something was really working well here. And over the 7 years that we studied this orchard, we boiled it down to three key things that really stood out. The first was that there was a very low intensity recycling of nutrients. The second was that there was a high number of predators, which was quite surprising. And the third was that we think the organic approach to the management of the land was clearly contributing. So the first one, the low intensity recycling of nutrients, what does that mean? Well, deadwood is one of the most overlooked yet valuable resources to a natural system that there is. I describe it as the fuel for the biodiversity engine in our book. It's one of those things which for so long we've been so used to tidying and cleansing and sanitizing away. If you go to a public park today, for example, it's very rare to find any volume of deadwood. Yet if you go, as I've done and Ben's done, to the forests of Eastern Europe, perhaps to the Polish Białowieża, one of the most famous ancient forests there is, the volume of deadwood on the ground and as standing is staggering. It must account for, various figures show that there's about 30% of woodlands like that can be dead. Standing dead trees, fallen dead trees, huge specimens that are just left to rot and decay. And when you think about it, it's clear, that is one of the components of an ecosystem, which that whole woodland environment, and in this case, the wood pasture environment, has evolved with. All of the species that naturally do very well in this environment are clearly using the deadwood. And so we started to study the deadwood a little bit more and find out which species were using it. And I'll show you a few of those. The first thing we noticed is that the deadwood provides habitat. The structure of having broken deadwood in the landscape meant that species had more nesting choices and they had more hiding choices. So this is a blackbird nest in the rotten upturned stump of one of the old apple trees that the owners could have grubbed up. They could have cut it down and used it as firewood, but instead they just left it. The tree wasn't getting in the way. They planted a new tree a few meters away, that once this tree, the dead tree, was rotted and disappeared, the new tree would then take that footprint. But for the life of this very rotten tree, and this one lasted about 5 years before it eventually keeled over and collapsed in on itself because the core was completely hollow there. In that time, we found blackbird nests in it, we found song thrush nests in it, and we found a wren nest bolted on the outside in all of the epicormic spindly growth that was sticking out the side of it. The other thing you get with standing deadwood is a huge fuel source for fungi. I'm sure, as many of you are aware, the fruiting bodies that you see of, toadstools, mushrooms, and bracket fungi like these are turkey tails. That's only produced to release spores. The majority of that organism lives either under the ground or inside the deadwood. The mycelium works its way down through, and that's what's the fruiting bodies, the things that you see, the mushrooms and toadstools and brackets like that. That's what they're drawing their nutrients from, is the network of mycelium that's inside the tissue. In this case, it's a soft rot inside that deadwood there. And that is what other species like woodpeckers need. They need that interplay between live wood, deadwood, fungi, and that gives them the conditions that they need to excavate a cavity. But so often a tree like this, particularly if it's anywhere public, is removed because it's perceived to be ugly, or it's perceived to be a health and safety threat. But in fact, trees like this can stand for years without causing anyone any trouble at all. And just by lopping off a few of the outer limbs, you can see how that one has had some of the more precarious limbs taken off it. You protect it against storms. Some of the trees which are left completely untouched will only last a few seasons, whereas one like this can last a decade or more, just rotting away like that. And then as those rots work their way down inside the cavities of the trees, you find situations like this. Some of these trees are still live. They have cavities up to sort of 10, 12 inches across inside the body of the tree. And as those rot out, the action of insects having worked away at the wet rot that the fungi have created, you then get an empty cavity inside the tree, still with a live cambium and producing fruit on the outside of the tree, live bark layer. The inside of the tree is completely hollow, and it provides brilliant cavities. In this case, that's a jackdaw nest. And we were finding very good productivity of the jackdaws in the orchards. And sometimes a tawny owl would come and boot out their jackdaws, and the tawny owl would nest in one of these cavities. But having that for age class of trees within the orchards, from very young trees, just a few years old, through to the ancient veterans, getting on for well over a century old, that provided that diversity of cavities that the species that depend on the orchard need. This is a different jackdaw nest, so these chicks are just a day or two old, already calling, and you can see the diversity of things that the nest is made of there. Bits of old newspaper, lots of bits of sheep wool that are all compacted down on top of each other to provide a snug little spot for those baby jackdaws there. The other thing is a low recycle of nutrients. So not all of the apples are harvested from these orchards. A lot of the fruit is left on the ground, so this fair percentage of it is harvested for cider and for perry, but a lot of the fruit is left, and that means that mammals such as voles are able to feed on those. Badgers absolutely love feeding on fallen apples, and then importantly, you're providing that conveyor belt of food for the winter thrushes. Just fruit falling all the autumn, stays on the ground all winter, and the winter thrushes that come in and they search across the orchards for food sources like this. These winter thrushes will get, 1 million plus redwings and fieldfares come in from Scandinavia and Alenia. Sometimes many millions come in a busy year to feed on our berries and our fallen fruit across the whole of the British countryside. In old orchards, particularly ones that aren't intensively picked, where some fruit is left to fall on the ground and left for those birds, are favoured spots, and you can get flocks of many hundreds of mixed thrushes in those old orchards. The other thing that we were finding was that the cavities aren't just used by birds. We were finding hornets very regularly over winter, and hornets thrive in old orchards. Queen hornets, such as that one there, will find a nice little cavity. They'll tuck themselves up, they'll bind on with their mandibles, they'll bite into the softwood, and they will lock themselves in that position and stay there for sort of 4 months of the year over the winter, the coldest winter months. But before they do that, they will have already stocked up on the fruit that's left on the ground. So, leaving a few of those apples and pears and perry pears on the ground will mean that species like hornets and butterflies, some of the larger nymphalid species like peacocks and red admirals and small tortoiseshell, which overwinter as adults, they will all depend on that fallen fruit to stock up on the sugars that they need to keep themselves fed throughout the winter. Even though they slow their metabolisms down, they need those fat reserves and sugar reserves to be built up before they go into their hibernation or their torpor. And there's one of the jelly ear type funguses that we were finding. The next thing we were finding when we were looking through this deadwood was an incredible abundance of big beetles, large invertebrates. And these are one of the species. This is a rhinoceros beetle. The gnarled textures on that piece of bark are produced by various other species of beetle that all depend on deadwood. And without, the minute you take away, any volume of deadwood, you're taking away that food source for those beetles. And they're saproxylic beetles, they're obligate feeders on deadwood. They need it. They need that as part of their life cycle. And the vast majority of their life cycle is spent feeding on deadwood. The adult beetles will sometimes only emerge for a couple of weeks and often not even feed. Whereas as a larva, the majority of their life cycle is spent inside deadwood. So when that deadwood is cleared from the land, you're simply taking away the food and you're taking away large beetles like that. This one is one of the ground beetles, which preys on slugs. Brilliant species to have anywhere. Of course, it'd be very welcome in most gardens. Anything that eats slugs is always welcome. So again, a species which as a juvenile will live in this deadwood, and I've peeled open pieces of deadwood before and found the adult there waiting to emerge, waiting until spring to come out from its deadwood cocoon that the larva made. The next thing we were finding in the orchard was an extraordinary abundance of predators. Most places in the British countryside now, we're used to seeing far fewer predators. Over the years, particularly as a result of persecution, both legal and illegal, predators have almost completely disappeared, right back to the Victorian Grain Acts, where who was it? Elizabeth I signed off documents that said, you would be given a bounty for any sort of vermin that you captured, right down to bullfinches and kingfishers. These species were being taken, and all the way up to wolves, wild cats, all of the birds of prey. Anything that was considered a threat to human food production was considered vermin. And that persisted for centuries. These species were heavily hammered. They were hated. And now finally, in the last few decades, we've begun to realize that predators play a really important role in the ecosystem. And one thing we noticed in the orchard was, a huge abundance of a variety of different predators, particularly avian predators. The tawny owl density there, if we were to go, and sit out in the orchard this evening, there would be young tawny owls calling for territory, the adults would be starting. And if you were to go in the spring, you would hear the constant begging calls of young tawny owl chicks in every different orchard. I think we calculated that there are about 6 pairs across the site, each producing between 1 and 3, 4 young. So the production of predators from an orchard environment can be very high indeed. And tawny owls are a real generalist when it comes to prey. The voles obviously will be targeted, but we've seen tawny owls bringing in everything from slugs to slow worms to moorhens. They are phenomenally efficient predators, tawny owls. A very aggressive owl. They will dominate most of our other owl species. And they do very well in an orchard environment when you have that diversity of old trees that give them the cavities that they need. Tawny owls almost always will choose a cavity. They will sometimes nest in an old crow nest or a flattened dray. But when given the choice, they really like to nest in a cavity. So having those big old trees with those big old rot holes gives tawny owls somewhere to nest. And, this is one of the branching tawny owlets that I found in the orchard. Just walking through the orchard, you can see the mistletoe there and no leaves on the trees. I can't remember when that was. It was quite early in the season. But fantastic just to see young owls sitting out, trying to avoid the attentions of jackdaws and magpies whilst waiting for dusk to come and then to get their evening meal. The other predators that we found in the orchard, we write about it a lot in the book, but the sparrowhawks that we found that were working their way through the orchard soon, in our first few years we were there, we were seeing sparrowhawks quite regularly. They soon disappeared and just stayed at one end of the orchard after the goshawks turned up. And there was a day when we just kept finding these kills. We were finding magpie kills, scattered piles of magpie feathers, and then a few hundred meters later we'd find a wood pigeon, scattered wood pigeon feathers. And this went on for a period of weeks actually, and we thought, there's something big around, and we assumed it was a big female sparrowhawk that must be taking these birds. Then one day in spring we looked up and we saw a pair of goshawks come up out of the woodland, calling to each other. The male flew really slowly, doing his beautiful mating display where he shows off to the female how slow he can fly, flashing his white undertail coverts. And we realized, and then they talon grappled. So the male went under the female, they fell out the sky together. And we realized, we have a mated pair of goshawks here. And the goshawks were obviously were breeding from that display. And in subsequent years, we found the nest, and they are doing very well, producing a few chicks each year. The final main predator, avian predator that we have in the orchard is the buzzard, and the buzzards do a very good job of keeping the jackdaw numbers in check. You've probably seen corvids going over and mobbing buzzards, and most of the time buzzards just put up with it. You'll see the jackdaws going after them, and the buzzards will just sort of flick a wing and glide. But one time I was sitting watching a buzzard, and it glided across, and the whole flock of about 30 jackdaws went up, including some quite young birds, and they were taking it in turns to sort of peck at the buzzard's tail. And the buzzard ignored them, and eventually one bird came right over the top of the buzzard and sort of pecked its back, and the buzzard flipped over, punched the jackdaw with its talons, flipped back over, holding the jackdaw, which was now in its death throes, dropped it and carried on flying. The jackdaw colony went berserk. All of them followed this dead jackdaw down to the ground. But that taught, obviously, that young jackdaw and the ones that were watching that not to mess with a buzzard. Although they can look quite sedate and they'll spend a lot of their time just sitting on posts and in the winter eating worms and things, when they want to, jackdaws can be extremely efficient hunters. One of the other predators that we found in the orchard, not directly, but as a result of some work done by the Vincent Wildlife Trust, was that polecats are doing very well in Herefordshire. Sadly, this one obviously is not. We found this one just around the corner from the orchard. It had been hit on the road. And over the 7 years that we went up to the orchard, we found polecats hit on the road 3 times. It's always sad to see an animal hit on the road, but it does give you an indication as to the density of a species in an area when you're seeing lots of roadkill. And it was clear that polecats were doing well there. And the work of the Vincent Wildlife Trust has shown that old traditional orchards, particularly with the associated old farm buildings and log piles and the rabbit population, and vole population and rat population that you often find in those areas, that is a fantastic opportunity for a polecat to come and find a really good den site and lots of available food. So those areas tend to be used by female polecats to breed. One of the most surprising things we found, I was looking at some interesting footprints that the owner had sent me, and I set up a trail camera thinking that we might have a polecat visiting the orchard. Turned out that it was an otter. An otter which was well away from the main river. This looks like a river. This is just a small stream. It's an ephemeral stream that only floods in the winter. This was in February. The ponds had filled up in the woodland. This stream went round the back of the orchards, and about half a mile further down this stream, it joined the main river. This confluence is completely dry for much of the year, but the pond in the woodland was being used by frogs to spawn. And we think that this otter was working its way up this stream and must have been able to smell the spawning frogs, because otters love raiding frog spawning areas. There were other predators that we found. We once saw a stoat working its way up the trees, raiding nests. It was going in every old woodpecker hole looking for chicks. There's a very large badger set to the south east of the site. There are regular hedgehog sightings that the owners keep us informed about. And in the summer, when the hobbies come in, we see them hunting swallows over the orchards. So it was clear that this orchard was providing, just by having this high number of predators, it was clear that there was a really successful food chain going on here. The next point that was really clear and is probably completely self-evident is how important a low input organic approach is to the quality of biodiversity supported by any landscape. There are no inputs that go into this land whatsoever. It is a completely organic orchard. And that was, really evident by the number of insects that we were finding. Again, it's a common story. Insect numbers are collapsing, with all of the available science is showing that insect numbers are collapsing. And this is, a headline from The Guardian in 2019, but, it doesn't take much research to just find data from across the world from most insect populations that are being studied. Our insect numbers, and insects outweigh humans on Earth by 17 times, in terms of biomass. Insects are really important. They are the foundation of so many of our food chains. But that particular journal, that particular paper published in Biological Conservation says intensive agriculture is the main driver of insect declines, particularly the heavy use of pesticides. So in environments that have no pesticide input, and again, we write about this in the book, and you can go to these landscapes such as to a traditional orchard, or if you visit much of Eastern Europe, you will see what an extensive low input landscape looks like, just in terms of the bioabundance, as well as the diversity of insects. And again, it was finding those large insects that was really clear to us that this was a system that was working. The beetle on the left there is the rhinoceros beetle again, and the caterpillar tucked into the apple leaves there on the right is an eyed hawk moth. Hawk moths are some of our most spectacular moth species, but eyed hawk moths feed particularly on malus, apple species. They're clear, and that's what the adult looks like, this huge moth with beautiful spots on its underwings, and it's only by having low intensity environments where these species can breed with no pesticide inputs that you allow your caterpillars, and this caterpillar gets to about 4 inches long, they're massive, that it will allow it to the space to breed, and you end up with beautiful species like that. And it's important that we have those large insects in a landscape, because it makes it much easier for the birds, mammals, and other insects in some cases that feed on these to get a good meal. If the size class of the insects as well as the biomass is decreasing, it makes it much harder for species like bats, for example, to go out and find a good meal if they're constantly relying on just eating mosquitoes or the tiny little micromoths. And alongside that, we were finding really rich soils, full of crane flies. I can remember evenings where I was out there with a torch watching the ground just writhe as all of these crane flies emerged from it. The meadow in the winter underneath the trees, if you were to pull up a clump of the grass, it would be full of different moth caterpillars. And the worm numbers were clearly very high, judging by the rate at which thrushes were feeding their chicks. This is a vapor moth that I found, one of the trees on the edge of the meadows that surround the orchard. Again, we have thousands, I think about 3,000 different macro micro moth species in the UK. We've got about 60 species of butterfly. We only get those species where their food plants grow. You will only get them. You'll only get a good population of them if the caterpillars have got something to eat. So by providing that diversity of different environments around the orchards, meant that we would, and also having no pesticide inputs, meant that we were seeing some phenomenal species. On every trip we go up there, we will find an interesting caterpillar just by chance, without even looking for them. And the final big bug that we were finding, the maybugs, the cockchafers, we were taking light traps on there. We were sometimes getting double figures of cockchafers in the light traps. Cockchafers are one of those species that, again, spend the majority of their life underground. The grub is quite large. It's sort of a waxy white color. You might have found them when digging up the garden. They eat roots and things. But again, on a good warm evening in May, you'll often see huge numbers coming up out of a low intensity grassland. A really, really important species for birds and larger bats. So alongside studying the orchards, we also spent time taking photos. And I have a real passion for photography. And I started developing techniques to get wide angle shots of the species in their habitats, to try and show how those animals were using their landscape. And the very first shot I ever got was this. It was not in an orchard tree. It was at the orchard in one of the non-natives. It was a missel thrush, slightly out of focus, feeding its chicks. But that got me hooked on the idea of being able to get a camera to showcase the lives of the species that we're using the orchard. So I'm going to give a bit of an overview as to what we found across the year and some of the highlights that we particularly enjoyed finding across an orchard year. Spring is undoubtedly has to be my favourite time of year at the orchard. It's when it really comes alive. The sound, as I mentioned earlier, of the orchard in spring, the dawn chorus is absolutely spectacular. With all of these different species working to proclaim their territories and announce to their mates that they're the best territory in town. And they're not wrong. So the quality of the territories there. I've seen song thrushes get away 3 broods in the same nest in a single season at this orchard. It's 4 chicks in, out, lays eggs again in the same mudline nest, 4 chicks, and it's brilliant. It's brilliant to see just how well these birds are doing. But the original reason for studying the orchard was to look at some of the rarer species that we use in the orchard. This is a redstart carrying a false click beetle in its beak there. And the redstarts and the spotted flycatchers, real rarities across the wider British landscape now, seem to be thriving in this orchard. So a few of the highlights that we found in spring. The first thing that comes out in spring that we really notice is the blossom. And as soon as that blossom comes out, the whole sound of the orchard changes, because it begins to attract the bees. And there are days I can remember going up on a March morning when late March, when the willows are out and the blackthorn's just starting. And the blackthorn comes out in April and the hawthorn's starting. When the sound of a sallow bush, or even a little bit later in the season when the hazel's out, sound of a hazel bush, all of those bumblebees that have come out from hibernation, they're really hungry. They need that early nectar flow. So March and April are really important months for our invertebrates, which have spent time underground. So this would have been a queen tree bumblebee. She would have come out from hibernation. Her fat reserves would have been very low. The first thing she needs to do when she comes out on a first warm spring day is to go and find nectar. And she will beeline straight for the trees. There are a few flowers out, which I'll get to at that time of year, but it's the trees that provide the bulk of the nectar and pollen for species of that time of year. And they really kick off the nectar flow across the year. And obviously the meadows take over once you get into May. But for March and April, the trees are providing that really vital pollen and nectar. And the bulb species begin to come up. So this is the woodland adjacent to the orchard. The bluebells have started to come up. The wood anemones are starting to come up. And then some primroses there. And the first flower that we really notice to come up in spring is the cuckoo flower. So this is a really, really important species for one particular butterfly. And if you can see in the middle picture, there's a little orange egg on the left-hand side of the flower there. And on the right-hand picture, there is a little caterpillar. And that is the egg and the caterpillar of the orange-tip butterfly. Now, it's only by having cuckoo flowers, and it's only by having a wet meadow, and it's only by having a low-intensity wet meadow that you have cuckoo flowers, that you end up with these exquisite little orange-winged butterflies. The males have the orange tips. The females are just like the male, but without those orange color spots. And it's only as a result of having those low-intensity meadows with low-intensity grazing, in which the cuckoo flowers are allowed to grow up, that you get these beautiful little butterflies emerging each spring to lay their eggs on those cuckoo flowers. We also start to find missel thrushes. So missel thrushes are appalling nesters, dreadful. They nest really open cavities just in the fork of a tree, or the three-way fork of a tree like this one. But missel thrushes, they'll build their nests out of moss and sheep's wool and grasses. And we always enjoy looking for those, but they seem to have a strategy that relies on a fair number of those nests being predated. The local corvids, jays and magpies and jackdaws in particular, are incredibly good at watching missel thrushes, finding where they're nesting. And eventually the missel thrushes will sometimes change tack, and they'll go higher up into the trees, often into the base of clumps of mistletoe, and relocate their nests there, having lost a few too many nestlings in situations like this. This is actually a song thrush nest that had nested inside an old missel thrush nest, inside an old ball of mistletoe. So there is a debate around how much mistletoe you should have in an old orchard, which I'll save for another day. But generally, by allowing some mistletoe to persist in an old orchard, you're creating spaces in which birds will nest. And I've found blackbird, song thrush, mistle thrush, and wren nests all within balls of mistletoe. So it's an important species. And later in the winter, it provides for the winter thrushes who eat the berries. This is a nuthatch that we found, again, a cavity nesting species. They will modify the entrance to their hole using mud. And we've spent some fantastic time with nuthatches in the orchard. You often see them in woodlands nesting very high up. In the orchard, we were finding them nesting just a couple of meters, sometimes 5 foot off the ground if there was the right cavity there for them. And this is the male passing a large grub that he will have found by rootling in underneath loose bark to give to his mate who had chicks inside the nest there. Blue tits do very well in any area where you have cavities, but in the orchards they absolutely thrive. They were getting away broods of 10 chicks sometimes. There was a steady flow of caterpillars and small spiders and things coming into the chicks. And again, they would find all sorts of cavities. Almost every small cavity was taken up by a blue tit, a great tit, or a marsh tit during the nesting season. The next species that we really wanted to find were the woodpeckers. As I mentioned earlier, we were dreadful at being able to get woodpeckers into our nest boxes, but we found a real successful technique of finding their nests. The ops would always be the more dominant species in an orchard. They are the real bullies in the orchard. They are very dominant over green woodpeckers and over lesser spots. And the best way to find them is actually just to walk the orchard and listen for this very loud kecking sound that the chicks do when they're getting quite large. And we probably find between 3 and 4 great spot nests each year in the orchards. Great spots have a really interesting story with starlings. The national decline in starlings is well documented. One of the main reasons that starlings are declining is a lack of food. One of the main things they feed their chicks are cranefly larvae, leather jackets. As many of your meadow owners will know, leather jackets are considered a pest in grasslands because they eat grass roots. Traditionally managed meadows can be fantastic for leather jackets, and starlings can thrive being able to find lots of food in them. But unfortunately, due to intensive pasture, the use of pesticides on those, and particularly the dung that the pasture animals are pooping out onto the ground containing ivermectins, the soil invertebrate biomass has collapsed in many of those pasture-driven systems. And that's meant that starlings just can't find enough food for their chicks, their nest productivity goes down, and the net numbers of starlings in the UK are collapsing. One of the big problems with that is that starlings are actually really bullish. One of the few species that great spots are subordinate to are starlings. And starlings used to nest almost exclusively in tree cavities. So great spotted woodpecker holes are a fantastic place if you're a starling to raise a family. And what used to happen when we had a really high starling population and lots of tree nesting and lots of areas where they were overlapping with great spotted woodpeckers is they'd wait for a great spotted woodpecker to almost finish nesting, and the starlings would go in and go, thanks very much, boot them out at the last minute, and the great spotted woodpeckers were very unlikely to have a successful nesting season. And that meant that the starlings did well. They got the free cavity excavated by the great spots. The great spot numbers were held in check. And because great spots are a predator of lots of the different cavity nesting species, that meant that other species weren't predated to as high a degree as they are now. But now great spot numbers are booming, and that's having a real knock-on impact. This is a picture of a great spot holding in its beak the body of a great tit chick, which it is hammered out of its nest cavity. It will stick the great spot chick into a wedge in a piece of wood. It will then pull off the wings, pull off the head, pull off the legs, and feed them to its large chicks, one piece at a time. That's a really important part of the great spot breeding cycle because it gives those great spot chicks the protein shot that they need to develop into healthy young fledged chicks. But obviously, if the great spot population gets too high, that can have a really important knock-on impact on the chicks of the great tits, blue tits, tree creepers, nuthatches in cases, and importantly, the lesser spotted woodpeckers, which are doing very poorly indeed. And we've had years where the great spots did indeed hammer into our lesser spotted woodpecker nests and kill the lesser spot chicks to feed to their own. So, oh, and this is a wren. We're finding loads of wrens in the orchards. They love to nest, build a ball of moss, and they'll tuck it into a patch of ivy. The summer is so that we're sort of, the spring morphs into the summer. Very, there's just one continuous season in the orchard. But the few species that really start to appear in the summer are the spotted flycatchers. They've flown all the way from sub-Saharan Africa. They work their way up across the Mediterranean, up through France. And the same flycatchers have been nesting in the same cavities sometimes for the entire period that we've been studying at the orchard. In fact, for 6 years, one female came back to the same brick cavity that we had in one of the sites, one of the buildings that borders the orchard. So it was amazing to see that this tiny little bird, which we knew was migrating south of the Sahara, was getting back to exactly the same spot in the orchard that we were studying every year. And sadly, last year she didn't come back, and one of her chicks chose not to nest in the brick either. So that's again representing a national decline in those migratory species, which is probably reminiscent of a wider problem, even over the top of decline of prey in the UK. That's possibly a climate-driven change. Some of those species are finding it harder and harder to cross a growing Sahara now. So this is what the orchard's beginning to feel like as it moves from spring to summer. The meadow's starting to come up. The sound is now more baby birds fledged around the place. The apples are starting to appear on the trees. And it's a really, again, magical time of year because the insect numbers are really starting to boom there. You're seeing that productivity of all of the different components of the orchard come good as the insect numbers end up going through the roof, feeding these species. That is the spotted flycatcher that we watched for year on year. She'd come back to that same brick. Either her or one of her daughters or one of her sons would be nesting in that brick. Little tiny nest there would fledge chicks from it each year. And we just hope that one of them will go back to that, because it's, that little tiny cavity there must have fledged the best part of a few hundred spotted flycatcher chicks over the many years that the birds must have been nesting there. Very cryptically camouflaged eggs, very subtle but beautiful coloration to them. And this is, how the spotted flycatchers will use that environment. They will find a piece of ivy against the trunk of a tree, and they'll nest in a little cup tucked in behind that. The redstarts are also back in. As I said, one year we had 6 pairs of redstarts across the orchard. Again, this is a species which is doing poorly. It's on the on the BTO red list. There aren't many of them left. But fortunately, the orchard, they do seem to be holding their own, and any little cavity that they can find, they're nesting. And sometimes even the tiniest little gaps that don't look like they could support a bird at all, we will be finding a redstart nest in them. Tree keepers, we call them the dentists of the treetops. They work their way into the tiniest little cavities. 14 millimeters can be the gap between a piece of bark and a tree that a tree keeper will wedge itself in behind. So, our smallest cavity nesting species is this bird, which will do a really good dentistry job, wheeling out those little insects which would otherwise be parasitizing on the tree, or just feeding on components of the deadwood on the tree. But the tree keepers will be there to hoover them all up as part of the free dentistry service provided by the many different birds in the orchard. But the tree creepers are one of my favorites, actually. And this is the bird that we spent longest trying to find. The lesser spotted woodpecker is one of the smallest birds you will ever see. Having seen them in the books, you think they're small. Having possibly read about them, you know that they're small. But when you actually see them, you realize just how tiny they are. And at the end of this, I will show you a little model of a lesser spotted woodpecker that I've had made by a local artist that I use in these talks, just to show quite how tiny these little woodpeckers are. But as I mentioned, they're not doing well. Possibly 500 pairs left across the whole of the British Isles. They are struggling. They're struggling for a number of reasons, but finding food and finding nest sites are 2 of the major contributors to their decline. And that nest hole there is the nest of the lesser spotted woodpecker. The cavity is about the size, that hole is about the size of a 2p piece, maybe a 50p, it's tiny, the nest hole of a lesser spot. So if you think you've got them, and later in the season, just check the size of the nest hole there and compare it to a great spot if you get a chance, when you get a chance to see them. But as you can see here, beak full of small green caterpillars there. That's the male. The female just left. Clearly doing very well in the orchards here. And sadly, this was one of the nests that we saw later in the season hammered out by a great spotted woodpecker. Those chicks were then fed to a great spotted woodpecker chick. And that's the problem. If there aren't species with an intact ecosystem, and obviously one orchard can't prevent the national decline in starlings, then species like great spot, they get out of kilter, the numbers get too high, and they have a real knock-on impact. This is a picture that a friend of ours, Sam Hobson, took of a different lesser spotted woodpecker nest in the same orchards, which is, you know, an absolutely gorgeous photo of the male at a beautiful nest site that they used one year. In fact, that tree there was used by a great spotted woodpecker the following year. It was then used by a grey squirrel, and 3 years later, that tree then fell down, and it's now just lying on the ground as rotting deadwood. And you know, great spotted woodpeckers will happily use a variety of different trees. Around the edge of the orchard, there are these massive old cathedral willows. One of the cathedral willows had a rot that was working its way through it that we couldn't see from the outside, but using its very clever beak, the lesser spotted woodpecker obviously found that rot hole and worked its way in. And 1 year, it nested right up in these willows, and making an almost impossible, lovely photograph of it nesting up in that. And you can see how quickly it can disappear. You know, this is a bird the size of a house sparrow. Once it flies up into those treetops to look for food, it's gone. The meadows in the orchard are fantastic, and they support so many different species. But one thing we really noticed was the high number of wasps and bees, solitary bees and paper wasps. So there are many different species of wasp in the UK. A lot of them nest in cavities or underground. You can see here, this is the early stages of the wasp nest expanding. So there is a paper wasp nest inside there. The workers there, all the females are picking bits of mud and carrying it out of the nest to expand that hole underground. And you've probably come across that same scenario a few months later, where a badger has then found that nest, smashed in the roof, and dug out the grubs. So the spring and summer are just a conveyor belt of breeding, and as you get into the autumn, the whole sort of tone of the orchard switches. The leaves begin to fall off the trees, the apples begin to drop, and you get into the cider season. So this is the most important part of the human side of the orchard calendar. This particular orchard used to use an old stone press, which it would use to pulp the fruit, and it was once rigged up to an old motorcycle there. It's an old matchless, I think, that used to spin that, the mechanical donkey. Now it's just used as a bottle store, but you can see all the old heritage attached to the orchard is still kept there. The field fairs, as I showed you earlier, are a beautiful part of the autumn orchard calendar, and I always look forward to their arrival. Very distinctive calls. In fact, right now, you're probably each evening hearing the redwings. They've just started coming in. Very distinctive seep call. If you go out on a clear night when it's not windy, just listen, and there's probably going to be redwings migrating nearby at the moment. And the whole look of the orchard changes. Once those leaves are off the trees, you can see how much mistletoe there is, for example. Now, as I mentioned earlier, mistletoe is a really important part of a traditional orchard. It provides food, it provides nesting sites, it provides shelter. But too much of it can be a problem, and particularly in a strong windy winter, a lot of limbs can be lost on heavily mistletoe-clad trees. So it is a delicate balance there. This just gives a bit of a feel. The jackdaw nest that I showed you earlier is in that tree on the right there. There were 3 different cavities in there, all taken up by different jackdaw families. And in some years, there is a tawny owl in one of those cavities that uses them. But there are about 4 or 5 trees like that, those really ancient apples in there, which provide those old cavities in this particular orchard. But across the orchards, there's a massive age class of trees. We've touched on mistletoe, but I just want to point out that those berries are a really important food source for the winter thrushes. So leaving a few of them will give food for those mistle thrushes and song thrushes and field fares in the winter. Now, I was going to chat a little bit about grazers. There's lots of different schools of thought as to how to graze an orchard. Some people mechanically graze them. They'll use mowers different times of the year and completely control that. They'll take crops of hay off, depending on the spacing of the trees. But traditionally, orchards were, pre-mowers. They were always grazed using livestock. And there are 3 species really which are used to graze an orchard: sheep, cattle, and pigs. Now, the Gloucester Old Spot is still known as the orchard pig, somewhat ironically, because you never find them in an orchard. In fact, doing the research for this talk, I've been unable to find any old spots which are being grazed in orchards. So if you know of some, I'd love to see your pictures. Please let me know, because I'd love to come down and meet some orchards which are successfully using Gloucester Old Spots as the orchard pig. And I'm going to get in touch with the Rare Breed Survival Trust and see if they can put me in contact with anyone who is grazing old spots under orchard trees. And obviously, pigs aren't a grazer as such. They're a rootler. They will work their way under the soil and turn it over, but it still has that same effect of keeping the sword length suppressed and creating that variation in sword height. This is a photo from the orchard that we studied. They were mainly using sheep. The sheep aren't there all year. They're pulsed twice a year to keep the sword down and create that structure within the grass, which is really important to prevent the grass from becoming too leggy. There's a variety of different species there that are sublet out to a local farmer, but those sheep do a really important grazing job underneath those trees just to keep that sword in check. But there aren't too many sheep that they ruin the floral diversity in the orchards. Other orchards I visited, this is Greg's Pit Orchard near Muchmarkle, and it uses Herefords. Again, they're not there all year, they're just pulsed in for a few months of the year, particularly during the calving season in the summer. Herefords are a fantastically docile breed. They do extremely well. This is a pear orchard, or peri-pear orchard, and the trees here, one of the common criticisms of having cows as a grazing animal in an orchard is that cows are so large and they love to scratch so often that they will take out small trees quite easily. I was extremely surprised to see the size of some of the trees in that orchard that were withstanding the scratching impacts of the cows. These were trunks of quite young trees still that seemed to be doing just fine. So it was interesting to know, maybe it's because the cows had their calves to look after and they weren't as interested in scratching, but for a few months of the year, each year, those cattle are grazed in that orchard, and you can have some quite small, maybe 20-year-old trees in those orchards. So if you've previously discarded cattle as an idea for your orchard, they do very well. And go and visit somewhere like Greg's Pit. James and Helen would be happy to meet anyone, show them the Herefords using the orchards there. Cattle, of course, are a woodland species. The highlands do very well in woodland and highlands. The longhorns do very well in woodlands. Of all the cattle species in the world, it's only domesticated cattle that have been put out on open pasture. We've sort of created a pasture species out of a wood pasture woodland species. Cattle, when given the choice, will always go into the woods and they'll feed on a diverse range of species, and they'll work their way between wood and pasture. So cattle in an orchard are very much a match if you have an older age class of tree that will support the scratching efforts when they do rub themselves up against them. Of course, this wild boar would have once worked through wild orchards, and yeah, we do see, and I would like to meet people using pigs, but we do know across the world, pigs are still an important part of the orchard environment. This is a bit of an overview of what the orchard looks like, and the meadows that surround the orchard, both within the orchard gaps, such as the orange tip meadow and around the outside of it, are really important. It was clear when we started studying the orchards that the environment around the orchard was as important as the orchard itself in providing for the species that are using it. So the old woodland that was alongside it, the extensive low grazed grasslands that surrounded it, all a vital component of that biodiversity engine which I referred to earlier. And just one example, the knapweed, as you've probably seen within your own meadows, some years it just really booms. Knapweeds are fantastic for a whole range of different butterfly and bee species, and hoverflies, they are really important for your pollinators. One thing we noticed one year is that just by having your knapweeds, allowing your meadows, allowing your different butterfly species, you get some really interesting spiders. Now, this is a really rare morph of one of the crab spiders. Crab spiders are normally white. This is the dark morph of a crab spider that's taken out of marbled white there. So, you know, again, a fantastic species to see just by spending time in the meadow. We were able to find sightings, you know, behavioural sightings like that. A few highs and lows across the orchard calendar. Finding the lesser spot nests, seeing the otters, hearing the redstarts and spotted fly catchers return. So, I mean, there are so many highlights in the orchard calendar, but there are also lows. You know, we would be finding nest boxes that have been abandoned, perhaps because one of the adults have been predated, or in particularly hot summers or very dry springs. We'd often find the tit species who were just abandoned, and they do this as part of their strategy for maximum productivity. They will abandon a group of chicks, even quite large chicks, and then they'll go and lay elsewhere once the caterpillar season catches up. Really low time is when we found great spotted woodpeckers that hammered out our lesser spots. That's, you know, it was sad to see. Of course, it's part of the natural ecosystem, and in a healthy, robust, huge system, of course, the lesser spot numbers can withstand that. But unfortunately, because of the way we've skewed the numbers of great spots in this country, great spotted numbers are doing very well. Lesser spotted numbers, not just as a result of great spot predation, are doing very poorly. So it's always sad to see a rare species getting hammered. There were so many surprises across the seasons. First was that great spotted woodpeckers hate nesting in nest boxes, absolutely love to smash them to smithereens. They use them as drumming posts. All of within a few by great spotted woodpeckers. So we've actually now switched to using woodcrete, this sort of concrete and wood chip blend nest boxes to reduce the number that the woodpeckers are able to smash open. Some really interesting behavioural observations. We once found an egg in the middle of a jackdaw nest in one of the cavities, and we thought, you know, who's this belong to? Did some research and found that the cavity nesting duck species are prolific egg dumpers. And we have a good population now of feral mandarin ducks in the UK. We had mandarin ducks nesting in one of the cavities in the adjacent orchard to this, and she must have been going around egg dumping in any nest she could find, and happened to dump one of her eggs in a jackdaw nest. Obviously, that egg didn't stand much chance of getting past hatching, because a jackdaw finding a duckling is probably going to attack it. But it might have been incubated for a few days before the duckling probably would have succumbed to starvation. We were often finding, you know, particularly as we started to mix up where our nest boxes went, and we found that birds will often use very low nest boxes, we were often finding mice in our nest boxes. So you'd have a nest box that might have been nested for a few years by a pair of marsh tits, and then a mouse would move in, and often these were yellowneck mice. Herefordshire is one of the UK strongholds for yellowneck mice. Yellowneck mice are much larger than wood mice, bright yellow collar, very pretty species, really big bullish mouse, and sometimes we'd find pairs of them snuggled up in our nest box, a real cute species to find. And we occasionally also found hazel dormice in them, but it was more often the yellowneck mice that we'd find in there. This was a funny scenario one year. We had a redstart nest in there, and the Herefordshire Council decided that the best place to put their public footpath sign that went through one of the orchards was hammered into an active redstart nest. So just shows a little bit of the disconnect that some people have with the natural world, and where isn't suitable to interrupt during the nesting season. We were also finding later in the season, originally we would take our nest boxes down in the winter to clean them, but we were finding that in some of the boxes in certain sites, we'd get bats using them. So we began to clean out our nest boxes in situ, and we'd be leaving them, the vast majority, up for the whole season. And the bats would be using those. So the birds would be using them in the summer, and the bats would be using them in the autumn, which was a great use of those cavities. I guess the important point that I've always tried to make with reference to orchards is that they're a completely managed landscape. It's completely up to you as an orchard owner, you know, how that landscape is managed. We went in as naturalists and found that traditional orchards are phenomenal for wildlife. But they're a farm, and it's really important to champion those farmed landscapes and show how important they can be for the biodiversity that use them. And it's completely up to the orchard owner to decide how much they wish to share that landscape with the wildlife that could be using it if given the chance. I'm going to whiz through this slide. Was a great tit nest. So one of the pictures I'm most happy with from the orchards, and a natural old apple cavity, and just fantastic to get a real insight into the lives inside these cavities and what these birds are up to. So I decided to take, having spent those years working out what makes an orchard tick, I decided to take those principles and apply them to my garden wildlife. I'm a passionate wildlife gardener. I have a small garden in North Bristol. It's on the back of a council estate. It's got some quite good connectivity on the back of it, and that it connects to an old railway line. But the same principles that made an orchard tick, I thought, well, all of those are going to work in a wildlife garden. And so over the years, I've been developing my wildlife garden. And there are 3 golden rules for garden wildlife. If you're trying to attract a species into your wildlife garden, you need to identify what it feeds on, where it breeds, and where it likes to hide. And if you can give your target species one or all 3 of those things, there's a very good chance that if it's got the connectivity, it's going to turn up eventually. So this is what I started with. I started with what I would call a blank slate. It was pretty much just a square of lawn. I took out the back fence panel. I heavily modified it. I completely changed the structure there, the setup of the raised beds, and it was just completely overhauled as to what I wanted to do to try and attract as many different species. And I did that by creating all of those different habitats that we found in the orchard, the deadwood habitats, the meadow habitats, the orchard trees. One of the first things I planted was my own orchard. You only need 6 trees to have your own orchard. I planted 7 as an insurance. I put in a pond, I put in the raised beds, I put in a real diversity of different plant species to try and attract in all of the different moths and butterflies that would be using them. And I put in as long a nectar flow as I could achieve. So I got in those early flowering tree species all the way through to the late flowering flower species, so that I had nectar and pollen in that garden for as many months of the year as possible. And this is what this wildlife garden looks like today. It's thriving, and I'm always surprised that in a little small patch of urban Bristol, the diversity of species that come in each year that find that little postage stamp of a garden just excite me every time I find a new species there. First thing, dig a pond. Get a pond in, get a pond liner in, really quick and easy to do. In a weekend, dig a deep enough hole that it's not going to freeze out over the winter. That's a recycled pond liner that I've been keeping for years for that purpose. And it wasn't long. In its first season, I found newts in there. I was finding frogs in there. And within a few years, I found my first great crested newt in there, which I was extremely excited about. And the nearest great crested newt pond I could find was about 400 or 500 meters away over the little railway cutting, and in the woodland that's up behind the fields that are up behind my house. So I was really excited to see these terrestrial amphibians making their way and finding my pond. And I now have adult grey-crested newts in there. I find the smooth and the palmate newts out in the garden regularly. For the majority of the year, newts are terrestrial. They only use the pond to breed in and to feed and to grow. And so, they will be hunting on land. They'll be hunting invertebrates on land for the rest of the year, and then they'll be going down into hibernation for the winter. As the garden developed, I was constantly learning and changing things within it, tweaking sort of what grew where, tweaking how to make a micro meadow. And the same principles that you'd use to manage a large meadow, I was using in a small meadow. I was using rotation cuts. I was trying to match the species that I planted using local seed varieties, and I was harvesting those seed varieties from nearby estates. So I got yellow rattle in as soon as I could. Yellow rattle is a hemiparasite of grasses, does a very good job of suppressing those aggressive grasses, allowing those other species like knapweeds to grow up through, and allowing some of the smaller, rarer plants to have a space to produce their own flower, pollen, nectar. I was also planting a few raised beds. I planted a herb garden. I was making that garden a space that, that I could use in the same way that the orchard was a space, a shared landscape between people and wildlife. A garden is a shared landscape between people and wildlife. All of those same principles. If you want to grow vegetables, I grew 2 raised beds. One of them I had for butterflies, one of them I had for me. And it meant, by growing those butterfly plants, I grew things like fennel, gave me a food crop, but also when I allowed it to flower, it was fantastic for hoverflies. and the different species of nectar hunting fly. They really were attracted to those umbilical shaped heads on them. I was also finding, by putting out moth traps and by finding some of the day-flying moths, some really exciting larger moth species starting to use the garden. And I'm confident that they were coming in for the different food plants. So on the left is a privet hawk moth that I caught in the moth trap. As their name suggests, the caterpillars feed on privet, but also willows, both of which I had in the garden. I inherited the privet, I planted the willows. And on the right is a scarlet tiger there. It's on one of the mullein species, but they will lay their eggs on things like comfrey and hemp agrimony, and then the caterpillars, as they grow, will work their way around the garden, and they're pretty Catholic. They'll feed on anything right up to nettles. But again, two really pretty moth species that probably were only attracted to the garden as a result of the food plants that I put in there for their caterpillars. You can see one of my pear trees doing very well in the back there. Later in the season, I made a sky table full of fallen fruit that was really attractive to different butterflies. And I was finding that flies and butterflies and all sorts of birds would come to these sky tables and take the fruit that I'd left out for them. And comma, another species which overwinters as an adult there, feeding on that rotting fruit, stocking up on its nectar reserves. As you develop a wildlife garden, you begin to realize how to rotate species in the same way that you might rotate livestock in fields on a much smaller scale. There are a lot of species that only produce a flower every second year. It was a good example. In the first year, it just stays as a small plant doesn't produce a flower spike at all. And in its second year, it produces those beautiful tall flower spikes, those lovely flowers, fantastic for invertebrates. And as soon as those set seed, they're favoured by things like goldfinches. I found that if you leave those teasel heads as tall as possible, you can actually top them up. So once they're empty of their natural native seed, you can top them up. If you've got a Niger seed feeder in your garden, just bring some teasel in, top up the teasel seed instead. Goldfinches love to work their way through teasel heads to feed in the winter. I was also putting in habitats for different reptiles and amphibians. As you saw, I was finding those newts out in the garden. I was also putting in slates and bits of rock like this, which were fantastic on old brush piles. I was really keen to attract in as many reptiles as I could into the garden. Urban gardens generally are pretty poor for reptiles, but if you give them the habitat, they thrive. So this is one of the brush piles that I put at the back of the garden. Each year I just put more and more vegetation on the top of it. It's probably about 4 foot deep now and squashes down by about a foot each year. New vegetation goes on. I put warm slates on that. It's a south-facing pile, and it's absolutely stuffed with slow worms. By giving those animals somewhere to feed, somewhere to breed, and somewhere to hide, I've been rewarded with a spectacular spaghetti bundle of one of my favourite little creatures. Slowworms are a lizard. They're a legless lizard, and they're not hugely common. But if you give them all of the components that they need, you can get a very healthy population. And just in that small garden there, on a warm sunny day, I can now go out and find about 50 slowworms under the slates and stones that I have dotted around the garden. So those are just some of the principles that I think you can apply, that taken from the orchard landscape to a garden level. Find them somewhere to feed, somewhere to breed, somewhere to hide, and it works so well with the slowworms. I also started really improving the fruit diversity in the garden. Raspberries from me, brought in wild strawberries. I selected a really good variety of blackberry. This one's got one of the bush crickets on it, and that in turn brought the biggest surprise that I had in the garden, which was a purple hair streak. I never, in my wildest dreams, expected to be able to find one of these butterflies in the garden, but it found its way in. It landed on the raspberries one morning, and I can only guess that it came in as part of having just hatched and needing nectar. It chose, there were oak trees probably that it would have hatched from when it was younger, and it probably came to the garden looking for the nectar that my garden had on offer in plenty. So it's by creating those habitats, by creating those spaces, you can end up with all sorts of different species. But that one probably goes down as my favourite of them all. So that's thank you for listening. That's the end of my presentation, and I'm more than happy to take a few questions now. So I'll switch back and see if Donna's had any and Tracy have had any questions come in.
Thank you very much. That was brilliant. Really interesting. Yep, we've had array of questions. So I'll kind of swing back to some of the first ones that came in, which was sort of more directed at the orchard side of stuff. So Michelle Grist wanted to know how big were the orchard you visited. You put that map up. I wonder if you sort of had an idea of kind of acreage, and she's asking about how many trees and the kind of ages of the trees as well.
Yeah, so there's about 700 trees across the 3 orchards. The orchards are all connected, as you can see from the map, and the ages go from first-year trees, second-year trees, from your very 3-4-year-old trees that are still well within a wire and have to be supported from grazers. The oldest trees are getting on for 150 plus years old. Some of those large pear trees are huge, and the veteran pears in that orchard are magnificent specimens.
Yeah, pears can get really very tall, can't they?
Yeah, and the good thing about apple trees is they mature so quickly. Apple trees become ancient veteran trees within sort of 40 years. So of all of the available tree species, if you want to get a patch of ancient old wood quite quickly, then apple trees are good for that.
Apples are good. There's another question a little bit along the same line. So they look like fairly big standard fruit trees.
Yeah.
And got a question in saying, does the ultimate size of the tree make a difference to the abundance and diversity of all that wildlife? So we're looking at M25 rootstock, which is a sort of large tree as opposed to some of the sort of dwarfing ones.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that the commercial varieties of really dwarfing rootstock, which are actually what I've used in my own garden here, they're fantastic for smaller spaces, but they are going to limit the variety of species that you're going to get in if you've got a large enough area, I'd always opt for standards. Go for those larger trees because they will mature into larger and probably, I don't have the science to back that up, but healthier specimens by being on those natural rootstocks. Whereas I'd imagine that something like if you had a huge orchard area just full of those dwarfing varieties, there probably is a limit at which species are not going to nest below. So even once it's a mature specimen, if it's only 3-4 meters high, that's probably the limit at which you're going to start to see biodiversity drop off. I've got no evidence of that, so it's actually a very good question that I don't know the answer to. My gut would be that I'm seeing the majority of nests, particularly for those rarer species, in those larger, older trees.
That'd be quite interesting to have a look, because obviously a lot of commercial orchards, they're sort of planted as kind of cordons. They look like kind of big hedges, really. Where I imagine the sort of old wood is probably fairly limited. I mean,
those espaliered orchards are ecologically dead as far as we're concerned as naturalists. You won't find any of your cavities there. You won't find any of your cavity nesting species there. They're a grapevine. They don't have anything on them.
I wondered actually how much in the orchards that you looked at, how much sort of tree pruning do they do? How much do the landowners?
They do a fair bit. It's nowhere near as extensive as I do know of quite a few traditional orchards that are heavily managed, where almost every tree is cut every year. So there is a degree of pruning, but it's not to the level of annual cutting for every tree. Sometimes a tree will go 3-4 years without any pruning at all. Before it's cut. So it all depends on the tree and how the tree is growing.
Sure. Robin Aronson would like to know whether you think predators have a positive effect on the biodiversity, or is the healthy predator population more of a symptom than a cause?
No, I think the healthy predator population has a fantastic place in the orchard. I think it's testament to the biodiversity system working within the orchard that we see that diversity of predators. I think you simply wouldn't be able to support that number of pairs of tawny owls, for example, if the orchard biodiversity engine wasn't working. So you'd be able to support a few pairs of buzzards there, and obviously these species are using the wider landscape. It's hard to say it's as a result of that one group of orchards that those species are doing well, but I think I've travelled extensively with my work. I've travelled to some of the most biodiverse places. The most biodiverse places I've visited in the British Isles, places like the Outer Hebrides, Isla, for example, North Uist, those places. If you travel, you can drive for a day in North Uist, you'll see 8 hen harriers, 6 short-eared owls, 10 eagles. It's very common to see predators. We've just sanitized our landscape to such a degree that we've normalized not seeing those top, managed, top regulated ecosystems. So I think it's fantastic to see those large predators in the landscape.
Yeah. I think that's the trouble, isn't it? Is we don't notice the things that disappear because it happens fairly slowly, or you don't remember back far enough because you're not old enough.
That shifting baseline syndrome
is a big problem. Shifting baseline, indeed. Yeah. There was a couple of questions around grey squirrels, and actually you mentioned that there were grey squirrels in the orchard. Robin was wondering what your view on controlling them was, and also he's got them in his orchard and seems to find they predate on quite a lot of bird nests.
Yeah, so the grey squirrels in the orchard are shot and eaten by by one of the owners. Grey squirrel numbers controlled, I think, very well. Grey squirrels, their only real predator in the orchard are the goshawks. So I'm, I think with those limited predators, until in a complete intact ecosystem, you'd have one of their major predators, such as the pine marten, back. Until we have pine martens back across the wider landscape, I'm more than happy to see low numbers of grey squirrels controlled if they're then eaten. I think it's a valuable source of wild meat.
Yeah. Okay.
And they do have a huge impact on bird nests.
Yes.
Really They're very efficient nest raiders.
Something we find actually in woodland. So we also had the question about the lesser spotted woodpeckers that seem to come in for a bit of a hard time. You mentioned that year where they wiped all of their nests out. Are they still there? Do they still manage to successfully?
Yeah, fortunately, they're still there. We always go back hoping each season to find them. Now, this year we didn't find the nest, but I did hear 3 calling birds, which were at least 2 pairs at the beginning of the season. So we know that they were there at the beginning of the season. I'm hopeful that they bred successfully. They're incredibly secretive. Anyone who's had the pleasure of seeing a lesser spotted woodpecker will know just how shy they are. This is how big a lesser spotted woodpecker is.
The model
was made by a fantastic artist called Carrie-Anne Gardner.
Great, isn't it?
I commissioned this just to be able to show on these talks. This is a life-size model of a female lesser spot. The first, it's actually based on a picture of the very first one that I ever photographed of the nest. So yeah, they do still breed in the orchard. They sometimes breed in the surrounding woodlands, but they are just a super secretive little species. And there's still a lot unknown about them. If you're interested, there's a wonderful project called the Lesser Spot Network run by Ken and Linda Smith. So if you are monitoring any lesser spots on your land, please reach out to the Lesser Spot Network. Ken and Linda Smith collate all of the sightings that people see across the UK each year, and they analyze that data for how the birds are doing, how much they're suffering from predation, what the productivity is. They lend out nest cameras if you want to get inspection cameras to get inside the nest and see what the productivity is. Really good project to get involved with. We've been involved with them for about 7 years now. Great.
I'm kind of aware we're running out of time, so I'll just mention a couple of messages here. So Jill Gardner says, thanks for a great talk. You say that these orchards are richer in wildlife than most reserves, and she's wondering whether a factor might be less disturbance by people and dogs.
Definitely. Yeah. 100%. We have very few areas in as
Yeah,
I'm sure we're all
it's
aware,
nice and quiet, isn't
it? Lower disturbance. Disturbance does play a big factor, particularly
Yeah.
for those ground nesting species. Dogs, in my opinion, it should be illegal to have a dog off a lead in the nesting season, irrespective of breed, any owner, anything. I think we need to set a national example that dogs can be exercised in dog exercise areas, but the damage that dogs do over to ground nesting birds in the breeding season is just
and their owners are not usually aware of it either, are they?
No,
okay,
it's
well,
naivety, sadly.
Sure. Yes.
Not malicious a lot of the time.
We've kind of hit 9 o'clock.
Yeah.
All of a sudden.
Yes.
So
sorry, I went on.
do want to thank both of you so much for coming along and sharing your kind of experience and knowledge with us as well. And also thank you for everyone for tuning in. I just want to quickly mention before we go that we do have more talks coming up, and we've got 2 in December, on the 2nd and the 9th of December, which are all about conservation grazing. So we've got a few speakers lined up, and they're going to cover quite a wide range of topics, from just starting what is conservation grazing, how to choose the right animals, alternative to wormers, which is something that you mentioned as well, Nick, wasn't it? Different sort of plant selection by grazing livestock, plus some great case studies from around Devon. The details for those will be on the Meadow Makers Forum and the More Meadows website, so do check those out and have a look. So from all of us, I'm going to say goodbye, and hope to see you in December. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for inviting me.